Johnny Tremain, A Story of Boston in Revolt by Esther Forbes, Chapter 3, Part 2. The coming of Mr. Percival Tweedy, journeyman silversmith of Boston, cast a longer and longer shadow over the Laffin household and conversation. While the terms of partnership were being drawn up, he stayed at a cheap lodging house in Fish Street. Johnny left right after breakfast and often did not return until dark. He did not meet Mr. Tweedy for a long time, and he got tired of hearing about him. Mr. Tweedy was ready to sign the contract of partnership Mrs. Lapham had drawn up, and Mr. Tweedy would not sign. When Mr. Tweedy came to the shop, it was Dorcas he seemed to fancy. No, it was Madge. Although almost 40, he was still a bachelor. Mrs. Lapham had asked him about that. Johnny already hated the very sound of his name, and then one morning before breakfast he met him. Mr. Tweedy was diffidently standing about in the shop, hoping Mrs. Lapham would ask him to breakfast. He was fingering a pocketbook sent in for a new clasp, and his stomach was rolling from hunger. "Hey," said Johnny rudely. The timid creature jumped like a shot rabbit and dropped the pocketbook. "What are you doing here?" the boy demanded, pretending he had caught a thief. Mr. Tweedy swallowed twice, his Adam's apple rising and falling with emotion, but said nothing. "After a thief, or are you that Tweedy man I've heard tell of? Are you a thief, or are you that Tweedy man I've heard tell of?" "I'm Tweedy." "I'm Johnny Tremain." "You don't say." "I'll tell Mrs. Lapham you're here for breakfast." "I just happened by. Just thought I'd come in." He had a queer, squeaky voice. Johnny disliked him even more than he had expected. Some impotence, some timidly, in a grown man irritated such timidly in a grown man irritated the boy. "Oh, come out with that flat," he said. "Come out with it flat," he said. "You've been getting your dinners here free for 2 weeks, and now you're feeling out for breakfast. I don't care, not me, but I'll warn the women to put on an extra plate." The man said nothing, but he looked at Johnny, and the look of bleak hatred amazed the boy. He had not guessed Mr. Tweedy had that much gumption in him. Mrs. Lapham came thumping down the stairs. It was her second trip to the foot of the attic ladder, and she still wasn't sure Dove and Dusty were out of bed. Everything had gone wrong. Breakfast was late. Madge had a felon on her finger and wasn't good for anything. And Dorcas was complaining because she had no butter for breakfast. She had slapped Dorcas, who had gone out back to cry. How easily, smoothly everything had gone in the old days before Johnny got hurt. Then the household went like clockwork, and shop had earned money for butter and butcher's meat once or twice a week. The sight of Johnny Tremain standing there in the lower hall, doing nothing, good for nothing, irritated her. "Hurry," she snorted, and waddled into the kitchen, Johnny on her heels. The fire was smoking, and she knelt down to mend it. Johnny might have done that while she was upstairs. Although Johnny was now looked upon as something of a black sheep, and Mrs. Lapham was no longer telling him he would end up picking rags, but on the gallows, he thought it behooved him to tell her just what he thought of Mr. Tweedy. "I can see why that Tweedy has never been a master-smith. He hasn't the force of character. As a man, he's no good. As if he is a man, which I doubt. I think he's somebody's spinster aunt dressed up in men's clothing." Mrs. Lapham heaved herself to her knees and brushed back her streaming hair with a red forearm. "You don't say!" Her voice showed her exasperation. She had found Mr. Tweedy herself. She was trying to nurse him along to get the weary creature to sign her contract and marry one of her girls. "Yep, I do say," said Johnny. "I've just been talking with him. He's no good, and he's here now. He's here now, she said. Yep, in the shop. That squeak pig is trying to horn in on breakfast. The doors were all open. Anyone in the shop could have heard Johnny's insults. Slowly, like a great sow pulling out of a wallow, Mrs. Latham got to her feet, glaring down at Johnny, her enormous bosom heaving. And I'm going to tell you what I think of that squeak pig without a word, and before he could finish his remarks or dodge, Mrs. Latham gave him a resounding cuff on the ear. Sometimes actions do speak louder than words, she said, and this is one of those times. You get right out of here, Johnny Tremain. That tongue of yours isn't going to do any more damage in this house. The end of chapter 3, part 2.